Let's begin. We are beginning the new Tractate Eruvin. It is a wonderful and monumental work. It is not an easy Masechta as far as Gemaras go. There's some new concepts and unfamiliar terms, but some of it we've already learned in Shabbos. So let's begin. The Mishnah, as we mentioned at the end of yesterday's share, just for a moment, because we made the siyum, so we started the new Masechta, is going to deal with an alleyway. And as you remember from the Gemara in Shabbos, you have houses. These houses are in a chutzner, in a courtyard. So you have multiple homes in a courtyard, and in the courtyard they did a lot of their household chores. So the houses were really for basic living. Maybe had a dining room and a bedroom, or they were the same, was sort of studio. And then you had courtyard. The courtyard serviced multiple houses, and then there were multiple courtyards that were serviced by a single alleyway. Though some of them were open through and through, and some of them were a dead end. So that's a mavoi mefulash and a mavoi she'enoi mefulash, whether it goes through or not. We'll talk about a mavoi mefulash where it goes through from side to side later on how you make that into a private domain and to allow carrying on Shabbos. But where it's essentially a cul-de-sac. It has its three walls, so then you would be allowed to carry in there on a Torah level, because that's midoraisa. That would be the three walls would make it into a private domain. However, it requires something at the front, either an actual mechitza, some sort of wall, and therefore a vertical post on the side would be sufficient to make it the fourth wall, just a tiny bit, but it'll nevertheless be a fourth wall. Or you need a demarcation to remind us that that's the end of carrying space. The two ways of doing it, and we'll see, we saw the Mishnah in Shabbos already, we'll see it later, are a vertical post or a horizontal post. Some opinions say both, some only a vertical post. So the post on the horizontal post at the top is called a korah, and the vertical post is called a lechi. And lechi is going to come up often, and korah is going to come up often. Here we have the concept of the korah above, and the Mishnah is going to tell us a maximum height for this korah. Two opinions in the Gemara are going to be: is it the maximum height for the korah based on the concept of noticing it? And since it's a demarcation, it's telling you here's the end of where you're allowed to carry to. And after that is a public domain, and you're not allowed to carry. It has to be visible and noticeable. And if it's not noticeable, it's not going to count. The other opinion we're going to see is that no, it's not based on notice, but rather based on since all the halachas we learn in regards to carrying and the prohibition of carrying in a public domain and what constitutes a public domain or a private domain, are learned from Diglei Midbar, from the encampment of Am Yisrael in the four-sided camps, the four camps around the Mishkan, and the carrying of the parts of the Mishkan within the Levian camp, which was a public domain because all of the Shvatim, all the tribes would come from their encampments through the Levian encampment to the Mishkan. So that was the public domain, and all the halachas essentially are learned from there. And since we're learning from there, there was what constitutes as an opening would be learned from the Mishkan. And as we'll see, there in the Beis Hamikdash, the opening was either 20 amos, 30 amos, 40 amos. We'll see different numbers based on how wide, 10 wide, 15 wide, based on 20 wide, based on the Mishkan. So the two opinions here again are: one is that we're learning what constitutes a doorway, a proper doorway from the Mishkan, from the Mikdash, the temple, or what's a noticeable demarcation of this opening. But essentially, as Rashi gives us in his introduction in the Mishnah, the Meshus HaRabim D'Oraisa, a Torah public domain, is where you have a space that is a street 16 amos wide at least, which is what we learned from the Glei Midbar, and it is open through straight from one side of the city to the other, or it's intercity from one city to the next. And
Rabbi, could you mute your microphone? There's a lot of noise in the background.
And this public domain, which is a Sratya Platya, you cannot make just a demarcation. There you'd have to actually make some sort of door or closing. However, the alleyway, which is not a public domain, halachic, the oraisa public domain, but nevertheless it does service the public, so it looks like a public domain, even though it doesn't have the halacha of a public domain for Shabbos, because it's not in the same type of public domain that you would have in the midbar in the desert, where Am Yisrael were, and therefore the halacha is that you're allowed to carry in this alleyway if you make the demarcation in the front, and as we saw in Shabbos, you also have a joint meal. So what we're looking for is the demarcation, specifically the kara, the horizontal post above the doorway. So mavoi, which is the alleyway, shu gavaya, which means the post that's the cross beam on the top of the mavoi, which is above 20 amma, and that's about 30 feet. You must bring it down to a lower than that, otherwise it doesn't count. However, Rabbi Yehuda says it doesn't have to be lower; it can be higher than that, and that's fine. And if it's wider than 10 amos, also it's not going to be fine. You have to limit it and bring it in narrower. And if it's wider than 10 amos, so it's wider than 15 feet. However, it has, which we just said is not valid. However, it has a doorway. So the shape of a doorway is that it has two vertical posts and one above. And it has to be directly above the two vertical posts. Then it counts as a doorway, which is what we usually use, you may know, from the wire over posts. What we call an Eruv line essentially is the horizontal line directly above the two posts. So if it has a tzuras haPesach, if it has the image of a doorway, even if it's wider than 10 amos, ein tzarich l'mayit, you do not have to make it narrower, because it counts as a valid form. Okay, so that now the Gemara says is going to ask a contradiction. Tanan Hasam, we learned over there. Sukkah shigavela malam amra. A sukkah is similarly, this same achlaka shows up in regards to the sukkah. If the sukkah is above 20 amma, meaning that your schach above the sukkah is higher than 20 amma, psula, it's going to be invalid. And Rabbi Yehuda says it is valid. Now the Gemara asks a question just in the terminology of the Mishnah. Why does our Mishnah say yamait? It tells you what to do. Limit it, bring it lower. So it's giving you the remedy. It doesn't tell you it's invalid, which it implies, but rather it just tells you you have to bring it lower. Whereas over there, it just tells you, it doesn't tell you the remedy. It just tells you valid or invalid. So Maishna Gabi Sukkah the Tana Psula, why over there does it say invalid? If it Gabi Movid Tana Takanta, and over here it gives you the advice, it tells you how to fix it. So the first answer is Sukkah the Araisa. Sukkah is a Torah prohibition. Tani Psula. So it's appropriate to use the term invalid, because we already, the way Rashi explains it, we already know this prohibition, meaning that it's invalid. So all it has to say is, this is not valid. On a Torah level, this is not going to count. However, Mavoi de Rabbanan. But Mavoi is a rabbinic enactment. So those that are enacting it for the first time have to tell you, here's how to make it. If it's too high, you got to bring it down. So that's they're instituting a new concept. So the institution of a new concept must tell you the way to do it. Whereas when it's an old concept, it's a Torah prohibition, a Torah invalidation of the sukkah. All that it says is this is invalid. That's the way Rashi interprets it. Tosfos interprets it differently, but the idea is the same. Or perhaps the Oraisa Nami Tanitakanta. Well, even on a the Oraisa, sometimes the Gemara will tell us the Mishnah will tell us the remedy of changing. El Sukkah, by Sukkah, the reason is something else. The Nefishin Mile, because there are so many halachas in regards to Sukkah. Sukkah has invalidations in the shape of the Sukkah, in the strength of the schach, how much schach, how little schach. For each one of them, if the Mishnah would also tell us, over here it's invalid, and so you have to add schach. Here it's invalid, so you have to add a wall. Here it's invalid, so you have to take away some of the schach. For each, you have to add a wall. If each one would tell you the remedy, then it would be too cumbersome and too long. And it's important when teaching a halacha to teach precisely and be somewhat exacting in the language so that the students will remember the halacha. Now, Sukkah to Fisher Mili, Pasik Vatane Psula. So there it just says one thing, invalid. Mavli, delay Nefesh Mili. However, by Mavli over here, it's one halacha. If it's too high or too wide, and therefore it does not say, it doesn't say invalid, but rather just gives you the remedy. Tanit Takanta. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Maral. So Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav, and here's going to be the first interpretation of the reasoning why this above 20 is going to be invalid versus according to Rabbi Yehuda that it's valid. And this is on the basis of a doorway, that the function of this opening is to create, of this crossbeam, is to create a doorway to the mavui, to the alleyway. And we're going to learn it from the alleyway, from the doorway of the Mishkan. The Chachamim learned it from the opening of the Heichal. So a little bit about the structure of the Beis HaMikdash. The Beis HaMikdash had the Temple Mount, the Har HaBayis, which was one Kedusha, into the Azara, the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash. Then came to the actual Beis HaMikdash itself, and it was sort of like a T shape. And the top of the T was where you entered, and that was sort of like a foyer, a big structure. And from there was another doorway into the Heichal, into the holy, the Beis HaMikdash itself. So the Chachamim are learning it from the doorway of the Heichal, of the Beis HaMikdash itself. However, Rabbi Yehuda learns it from the opening of the ulam of the foyer. The Tanan, as we learned, the opening of the Heichal, the doorway of the Heichal was tall, 20 amas tall. And it was 10 amas wide. And so that fits our Mishnah. The Chachamim say the max that you can have this doorway is going to be 20 high and 10 wide. However, the ulam, the foyer, the antechamber, which was a 40-foot tall doorway and 20 wide, that was that according to Yehuda, that's going to be valid. They both learn it from one pasuk. It says v'shachtu pesach oel moed. They shechted it at the opening of the oel moed, and so we see that what counts as a Pesach, what counts as a proper doorway, the doorway to the Oil Moed, to the Beis HaMikdash. There's the Mishkan, but it's the doorway of the Beis HaMikdash. The Rabbanan say Kedushas Heichal L'Chod Kedushas Ulam L'Chod, and the Rabbanan say that the level of kedusha, the holiness level of the Heichal, of the Beis HaMikdash itself, and the Ulam, the antechamber, the foyer, they were two different levels. They were two different places. halachically. And therefore, when it says the doorway of the Ohel Moed, it's talking about the opening to the Heichal, to the holy room itself, which is the Kodesh, and therefore the max is 20. Because the opening of the Ohel Moed is talking about the Heichal. Rabbi Yehuda However, Rabbi Yehuda says it's all one kedusha, and therefore, when it says at the doorway, it could also mean the doorway of the ulam, and therefore it can be even taller. And therefore, when it says the opening, the doorway of the Ohel Moed, it means the ulam itself as well. Or perhaps what we can say is Rabbi Yehuda says actually they are both separate places, and he agrees with Chachamim that the doorways typically when we're talking about the doorway of the Kodesh, it's the doorway to the Heichal, to the main room, and not to the foyer. So what's the reasoning of Yehuda? The chsiv for it says in the pasuk, Al Pesach Ulam, and it says Pesach Habayis. It says in Yechezkel, he says El Ulam Habayis. He says the Ulam of the house, which is the foyer of the house, and it says to the Pesach Habayis, to the opening of the house. And since it says the Ulam of the house and the opening of the house, so we see that the opening of the house is the opening of the Ulam itself. Therefore, from Yechezkel he sees that it counts as an opening, even in the opening of the Ulam. The wording that our Gemara has, Pesach Ulam Habayis, is not a pasuk. It never says to the opening of the foyer of the house, as Tues points out. But the meaning is that twice in Yechezkel it mentions the opening. Once it calls it the ulam of the house, and once it says the opening of the house, so we see that the opening of the house is the opening of the ulam of the foyer as well. Vaha ki ksiv hai b'mishkan ksiv. So Gemara says, what are you talking about? But when it says Pesach Ohel Moed, it's talking about the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the moving tent that was in the desert. It's not talking about the Beis HaMikdash. Well, actually, Gemara says it's interchangeable, and the Mishkan and the Mikdash, what a doorway over there is a doorway over here. Because if you wouldn't say so, then we would have a question on the halacha that Shmuel taught. If somebody shechted a carbon shalomim, which is even the weakest of the karbanos, and yet it would be invalid if they shechted it before the opening of the doors of the Beis HaMikdash. The Beis HaMikdash, typically the halacha is that every carbon must be brought after the tamid carbon. However, it could be it would still be valid if it was brought before the morning carbon, the daily morning carbon, as long as the doors of the Mishkan, of the Mikdash, are already open, and essentially the services have begun for the day. But if it was brought prior to the opening of the doors, then it would be invalid. Shenemar, how do we know that it's invalid? Because it says V'shachtu Pesach Ohel Moed B'zman Shepesuchim. Since it says that you would it has to be brought at the doorway, at the opening of the tent of the Mishkan. And since it's the opening of the Mishkan, we see that the opening means that the doors are open, and we're going to learn from Mishkan to Mikdash. So we see that the halachas are interchangeable of Mishkan and Mikdash, of the movable Mishkan, the tabernacle, and the Beis HaMikdash, what we call the temple. And not when it's closed. Even though that's written by the Mishkan, not by the Beis HaMikdash. Rather, because we see in the pasuk multiple times that they are interchangeable. Where do we see that? So Bishlam and Mikdash, the Ikri Mishkan, we see that the Beis HaMikdash itself is called a Mishkan. It says, and I will place my Mishkan, my dwelling amongst you. So you see that even the Beis HaMikdash counts as a Mishkan. And Mishkan Ikri Mikdash Minalan. Where do we have the reverse, that the Mishkan itself counts as a Mikdash? Are you going to tell me it's on account of this verse? Because the Kahasim carrying the Mikdash and they carried parts of the movable Mishkan, the tabernacle, not the Mikdash. And they upheld or established, affixed the Mishkan. So the Gemara says Adbam until they arrived. So now we turn to Beis Amud Beis. The Gemara says no, that's not a proof of Hu Ba'aram Ksiv. Maybe that it is called a Mikdash not on account of the structure itself, the Mishkan counting as Mikdash, but because they carried the Aron, the Ark, and that counts as Mikdash because it was the holiest of the vessels. So rather, it's from here, from the initial obligation of making the Mishkan, where the Torah says, "Va'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'secha." Make for me a mikdash, and then it goes on to tell you to make the Mishkan. So you see that the Mishkan also is called a mikdash, just as the mikdash is called a Mishkan. Now the Gemara goes to the width of the doorway. So up until now we're talking about the height, and now we're going to get to the width of that doorway. Bein l'Rabbanan, bein Rabbi Yehuda, everybody said that the doorway should be, in our Mishnah it says, 10 amos wide. Why don't we say from the opening of the courtyard? This is not the Beis HaMikdash itself, but from the courtyard, where there it says that they in the Mishkan they had curtains around, and it gives you the measurements of the curtains around. And the Gemara is going to make the calculation, which is going to tell us that it was wider than 10. And why don't we learn from that opening? Why don't we learn from the opening of the courtyard gate? The Chsifra it says, the courtyard was 100 in length, and the width was 50 by 50. And the height was 5 amos. This is the height of the curtains and the beams holding the curtains. So let's say 7.5 amma, approximately 8 feet about. And there were 15 amma, so it's a 50 wide, and there were 15 amma on either side of the doorway, meaning that you're left with the total 30 of curtain, left with 20 in the middle. And it says that each side, the shoulders, meaning the wall on each side, which one side was 15 amos and the other side was 15 amos, each one of them came up and butted up to the doorway. And there was 15 amos. So we see Malahal Chamish Barechav Esrim, just as over there, the doorway was 20 wide. Now it's true it was only 5 high, but we already know that it can be higher than that because we see that the doorway of the Beis HaMikdash counts as a doorway, either the Ulam or the Heichal, as we just saw. But so it can be taller than 5, but it should be also wider than 10 because we have a doorway called a doorway at Pesach when it's 20 wide. So the Gemara says, Pesach Shara Chatzer Ikri, Pesach Stamali Ikri. A curtain courtyard fence opening will be called just that, the courtyard fence opening. It would not be called just general opening. General opening is a doorway. When it says that there was that the Kollel, the curtains were 15 on each side. That's talking about the height. The Gemara says, what are you talking about? But it says that the height was 5, not 15. Maybe that's talking about the 5 is talking about it was 15 tall, but 5 above the Mizbeach, above the altar that was in the courtyard. Rabbi Yehuda says, actually, we're learning it from the opening of the ulam, of the foyer. And that room, as we saw, was 40 tall and 20 wide. And therefore, he says 20 wide is actually an okay width for the opening of your courtyard, of your alleyway. Wait, but in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't disagree about the line of the width. He only disagrees about the height and says, bring it where the Tanakama said bring it down below 20. Rabbi Yehuda said you don't need to, and in the width, the Mishnah says maximum width 10. If not, it needs to be narrowed unless it has a door frame, a tzuras haPesach, the image of a doorway. And Rabbi Yehuda didn't disagree about that. Amabaye Polig ben Brisa says indeed in our Mishnah it doesn't bring Rabbi Yehuda's disagreeing about that, but in the Brisa we see that Rabbi Yehuda disagreed as well. The Tanya we learned where it says that if it's wider than 10, it needs to be narrowed down to a narrower space. However, Rabbi Yehuda says there is no need to narrow it. So why don't we bring in our Mishnah, just as we brought the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda that it doesn't have to be lowered, so too we should bring the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda that it doesn't have to be narrowed. Well, in the Mishnah, when it says Rabbi Yehuda says that you don't need to, it's really referring to the next halacha as well. Okay, fine. So we'll accept that. But is it true? Is it correct that Rabbi Yehuda learns from the opening of the ulam, which was 20 wide? But we learned in the Brisa that if it was below above 20, the first opinion says, the Tanakama says, you have to bring it down below 20. Rabbi Yehuda machshir ad mem v'nun ama. And Rabbi Yehuda says it could be taller, it could be 40, it can be 50. Now, if he learned it like Rav, like the first opinion said, that the basis was that it has to have the structure of a doorway, and we see that the largest doorway we find in Tanakh is the 40 high by 20 wide. Well, then the max according to Rabbi Yehuda should be 40. Why in the Brisa do we have Rabbi Yehuda saying 40, 50, meaning it can be much taller, and then it can't be that he's learning it from the doorway of the ulam, because the doorway of the ulam max is 40. So still we'd see that you don't have anywhere the concept of a doorway larger than 40 amas high, which is about 60 feet. Vatani Bakapara ad mea, and Bakapara says actually it could be up to 100. So Bishlam Bakapara Guzman. So Bakapara you can say is exaggerating. He's just saying it could be huge, and 60 amas tall is huge. 60 feet tall, 40 amas is huge. Ella Rabbi Yehuda, my Guzman. But according to Yehuda, when he said 40, 50, that tells us it doesn't have to be 40. So that can't be. So if you learned 40 from the opening of the foyer, that's fine, but where do you get 50? So he said, you're right, that actually we're not learning it from the doorway, and the concept is not that it needs to be a doorway, but rather, as we saw that, as we mentioned yesterday at the beginning today, that the concept is it needs to be, since it's a demarcation to tell you where you're allowed to carry, and beyond there is the public domain, it has to be noticeable. And this brisa is what led Rav to make this mistake. The Tani we learned. If it is if the mavoi doorway opening is taller than 20 amas, which is the opening of the size of the opening of the doorway in the Beis Hamikdash, it needs to be brought down. So Rav understood that this is the basis for it is the basis of what constitutes a doorway, and according to Rabbi Yehuda, according to Chachamim, it won't constitute a doorway if it's above 20, because we learn it from the opening of the Heichal. And therefore, he said Rabbi Yehuda also is learning it from the opening of the ulam of the foyer. But it's not true. Rabbi Yehuda is learning it from a doorway, but he's learning from doorways of kings and palaces that have openings that are taller than 40 amma. Well, then why don't we also need doors? If you're learning it from the doorway of the Mishkan and the Mikdash, Well, there, not only did it have a door frame, it didn't only have a doorway, it actually had doors. So perhaps in order to have a mavui, a proper doorway to your alleyway, you'd have to have doors there as well. So why do we learn? So why do we learn, as we mentioned earlier today, that what constitutes as a valid demarcation at the opening of your alleyway? So Beishamai say lechi v'kara. You need a side, a vertical post and a horizontal post at top. Lechi okara. And Misil say either one. So the Gemara says, actually, you don't need a door. You're right. And like bring from Beishamai Misila, either a vertical post or a horizontal post, or Korah Beishamai both, and you don't need doors. And in the Mishkan also, in the Mikdash also, you didn't need doors. The doors were not there for the function of the opening, but rather for the privacy when it was needed. It was there to be closed, to give a privacy. Well, if that's the case, then a door frame where it looks like the image of a doorway, which is Tzuras HaPesach, it has two vertical posts and a horizontal post, should not work. The Heichel Tzuras HaPesach, well, why did you say in the Mishnah that if you have the shape of a doorway, that it can be even wider than 10? Well, you're learning it from the Beis HaMikdash, and the Beis HaMikdash had the door frame, and the max was 10. So if you're learning it from there, if our comparison in the halacha is being learned from the door frame, the doorway of the Beis HaMikdash itself, and there the max was 10 wide, even though it had a door frame. So in our Mishnah as well, we should say that the max width of your opening to the alleyway can be 10 maximum, even if you have a door frame, a proper door frame with a lintel with the horizontal line on the crossbar on the top. So why did we learn them? So why did we say in our Mishnah that if you have a proper Tzuras HaPesach, it could be even wider than 10? So the Gemara says, Midiu Taima Ela Rav. Well, that's only according to the teaching of Rav. Masni Rav Yehuda Lechia Bar Rav Kamei the Rav in a Tzarech L'mayit. Indeed, according to Rav's opinion, you do not have to make it smaller. As Rav Yehuda taught the Chia Bar Rav in front of Rav. And he said to him, actually, Rav said to him, you do have to bring it narrower. You have to, even a doorway has to be maximum 10 wide. So we see, according to Rav, he's fully learning it, it needs to be a doorway, and the doorway has to be in the same image as the doorway of the Beis HaMikdash. And the doorway of the Beis HaMikdash was maximum 20 high, 10 wide, and it had the door frame. So too in our Mishnah, where it says that if it had a door frame, it would be, you don't have to make it narrower, because even more than 10 amos would count. Rav says actually no, that in the Mishnah text, the correct text for this Mishnah would be that even if it had a door frame of 10, a door frame, it has to be max 10 wide and not any smaller. Elamiyata, the Gemara says, if you fully learning it from the doorway of the Beis HaMikdash, lo tahanile amlarta. So the amlarta should not work. And this is essentially, if you had a cross beam at the top of the on top of the alleyway entrance. Again, if we're learning the reason for the crossbeam is a demarcation to remind us this is the end of where you need to be allowed to carry. So it has to be max 20 amos high, unless it's made with beautiful shapes and artistry, because then it'll catch people's eye and people will notice it and they'll know, oh, here's the end. So an amlarta, which is an ornate beam, at the opening, that would count. That would be okay. However, but if the reason is that it has to look like a doorway, it has to be similar to the doorway of the Beis Hamikdash. Who cares whether you've made an amlarta, whether you made it look beautiful or not? It's not about catching your eye. It's about the definition, what constitutes a doorway, and we learn that from the Mishkan. And so the max is 20, regardless of whether it's beautiful or not.
But isn't that? I mean, I think it comes up later. Isn't it the whole thing is a hecker? We don't want people to go into the Rishus Rabbim by accident. So
right. Rav learns that it's actually doorway. That's what we're going through right now. That the Gemara continuously wants to go to its ultimate, at what the answer ultimately is going to be. The Gemara does say, like you're saying, that it is a demarcation to remind us this is the end of the carrying area, and beyond that you're not allowed to carry. However, Rav says that that's not the basis. Rav says that the basis is that it has to constitute a doorway, and that's what we're looking for. And so the Gemara constantly and he learns it from the Mishkan, and the Gemara continuously tries to say, well, then this shouldn't be the halacha, and the Gemara answers that according to Rav, indeed the halacha is different. So all this is according to Rav, that he interprets the reason that there's a maximum 20 high, maximum 10 wide, is because it has to be similar to the doorway of the Mishkan, and it has to constitute as a doorway. However, as you're saying, the Gemara ultimately is going to come to the opinion that, and which is the halacha, that it doesn't have to be a doorway, it has to be a proper demarcation that reminds us here's the end of the carrying space.
I was wondering another thing, because if we're basing it on the opening to the base of Mikdash, and the Inyan is that it's a hecker. So I was thinking there, not only is it tall, very tall, but also you're walking upstairs. I mean, just thinking about it practically, if I was walking upstairs, I'm not looking up to see the heck. I'll fall down. I'll trip. You have to watch where you're going. So you're not really focused on the height of the door there at all. You're not even seeing the top of the door. You're walking upstairs. It's I mean, relatively speaking, it's even higher. If I'm starting from the ground,
Bottom of the stairs,
it's
right.
even higher than what they're saying here. And so it's for sure difficult to say that that's because it's a hecker.
Right. According to Rav, it's not because of a hecker or a recognition of the end of the carrying space, for sure. Rav is saying it's the basis of needing this max 20 and max 10 wide, max 20 high and 10 wide, is simply we need something that halachically constitutes a doorway. That's all we're looking for. Rabbi Yehuda says a doorway can be 40 amos high or 50 amos high, etc., 20 amos wide. And the Chachamim say, no, max is 20 and 10, and we learned it from the Beis Hamikdash. But what we're looking for is the definition. What can be called a doorway, and what's properly defined as a doorway? That is the halacha that we're looking for, according to Rav, not a hecker. And that's why the Gemara says if it's not in order to recognize it, which when you make it ornate would actually work, but rather it's there in order to create the definition of a doorway, to create a doorway by halachic definition. So who cares if it's 30 amos high but ornate? That shouldn't be permissible because it's still not a doorway. And in fact, the doorway of the Heichel was beautiful. It was ornate, and nevertheless, the max was 20 amos high. The Tanan, as we learned, Chomesh Amalar Ta'is Shel Mela, there were these beautiful woods, the beautiful doorways made of this beautiful wood, Mila, 5 of these beautiful horizontal crossbeams above the doorway that were ornate. So since we see that it's that tall, so we see So that they had the doorway of the Beis Hamikdash had these beautiful doors, and nevertheless the max was 20 amas high. So so we see that regardless of how beautiful it is, the max of a doorway is 20 amas high. So why would Rav say, or in our Mishnah, according to Yehuda, why would it be okay if it was beautiful? And so the Gemara says, what kind of question is that? What question is that? Maybe the beauty of all those beautiful ornate beams were at the opening of the foyer, not the opening of the Beis Hamikdash itself. And the outer room, indeed, there was 40 amas high. That was something else. But we're learning it from the opening of the Heichel. And the opening of the Heichel maybe didn't have that. Right. Behind my cushion. So Gemara says, how's that even a question on the question on the question? Maybe they both had it because the opening of one doorway was the opening of the other doorway. Okay, so this goes into the next halacha of the size of or how the size and strength of the cross beam. So we'll leave that for tomorrow, Be'ez Hashem. So we're in the midst of this question. According to Rav's interpretation of the Mishnah, the reason why the crossbeam can be max 20 amos high, according to the first opinion of Yehuda, says that it can be taller, and max wide 10 amos, according to Chachamim, and Yehuda is going to say in the Brisa that it can be wider, is on the basis of which doorway are we learning it from, and what we're looking for is what constitutes a doorway. And the Chachamim say we learn from the Heichel that the maximum doorway is 20 amos high, 10 wide. And therefore, we ask with this question of Rav. Rav says that according to Rav, why would a malatois, a beautiful ornate crossbeam, count as a valid crossbeam? After all, it's too tall of a doorway, and we see in the Mikdash also that it had these ornate, beautiful doorways. Tomorrow we'll continue with that question.